So as a reminder of where we have been with the CCAT, which again is that acronym that refers to the Community Coalition Action Theory, our first step with the CCAT was reviewing the article by Butterfoss and Keegler and then having an in-person discussion about what resonated with us and what we kind of took away from the theory. And then we started thinking about how we can translate this theory into discussing our own coalition's work. So after we did the article discussion, your next step as project directors, you were introduced to this template that was a 9-page document that asked questions specific to each component of the CCAT. So that was where you really started to drill down and think about how does this theory relate to the work that we have been doing in our local communities. And then, of course, at our most recent face-to-face meeting, we had that one section that was still left, which was the community context. And we spent time together brainstorming what the appropriate questions would be for the community context. And after you responded, once those questions were finalized and you all responded to them, we have that completed. What began as a 9-page template, what we heard from some of you had grown to a 13-page document with your responses added in. So the question now remains, where are we headed next with this document? Some of you have been involved in some of the youth-led work in the past. So what you have displayed on the screen is an example of what some of the adult allies did as their work when they were grounding their youth-led programs. You'll see an acronym there that is the Youth Empowerment Conceptual Framework. That's what the YECF refers to. That was their organizing theory and framework that they were using when conceptualizing their youth-led program. So it's analogous to what you're using with the CCAT. So that was kind of their organizing framework. Your organizing framework is the CCAT. And what they began with was a template, just like you all began with your template. What it then got converted into was a 2-page narrative that was essentially an overview of their youth-led program in relation to the Youth Empowerment Conceptual Framework. After they got it into this 2-page narrative format, their final step was then converting it into, so kind of winnowing it down even further and converting it into what we refer to as a personalized YECF model. So this is a snapshot of both the processes that their group engages in and the outcomes that they hope to achieve as a result of their young people engaging in their youth-led program. So if we draw on some of that experience and think of where we are headed in terms of the work that we are doing with the CCAT, again, where we are currently is we have this 9-page document or this starting template. Our next step with this template is to convert those 9 pages into first 3 pages of kind of our CCAT narrative. So this will be the next step, is that you're going to be taking your original template and then winnowing down that information into the 3 pages. This will be interesting. I noticed when reviewing the community context sections that you all submitted to Nicole on Friday, many of you saw the link between the needs assessment and the introductory language that you used in your needs assessment for setting the stage for your context. So many of you submitted what's equivalent to 2 pages of just thinking about the context because you had that language readily available to you. And it was great to see the way that you could draw on your existing resources and see that relationship. Now, the next challenge will be this entire narrative. Your first step with the narrative will need to be 3 pages total. So the task is really critical in thinking through what is the most important information for me to present in each of the components from the CCAT. In your narrative, you'll be speaking to each of the components. So it's not an option to not have one of the headings from the CCAT. You have to speak to all of the components, but you're going to need to be very strategic in which information that you have documented you feel is most critical to include in this narrative form. You'll see that writing it into a 3-page document is the first step, and that's the first task that we're going to kind of work on between now and the next time that we convene. But I wanted you all to see that there will be another step of narrowing down the information a little bit further into 1.5 pages. If you look at the next thing, ultimately what you're going to have from this process will be 3 final products. So you'll have a 3-page narrative, a 1.5 page narrative, and then ultimately you will get your own personalized CCAT model that depicts the work of your coalition. Now you may be wondering as you're looking at this process why you're seeing both a 3-page document and a 1.5 page document. What we found through our work on other projects is that the different lengths speak to different audiences and that these tools are extremely useful for different purposes. So we want to make sure that you all are walking away with the tools that are going to be most useful for you moving forward. The 3-page narrative is particularly useful when discussing your work with community partners, discussing your work with new coalition members and orienting them to the work that's been done. They need a little bit more detail and description of what exactly is occurring. That's why, but of course, we also have to be, no one's going to read a 13-page document, right, when you're trying to briefly orient someone. So the 3 pages is to keep it relatively brief, but also allow for the rich description that may be needed for some of those stakeholders. We have also found that the narratives frequently get used, the language frequently gets used when working on future grant proposals. This is the purpose for the 1.5 page document, to have it even more concise for those external funders that may be interested in your work. It becomes extremely useful. We've seen this in the past where people can really copy and paste some of the descriptions that they have into the grant proposal because of how nicely the framing fits. And then of course the personalized CCAT model is that very concise description that can get displayed at different events or to different partners when you're trying to provide a very brief visual depiction of what exactly we are doing, while also highlighting that what we are doing is based in some sort of theory, right? That we're grounding our work in an evidence base. So these 3 documents become very useful for different reasons and purposes. So that's kind of the overall goal of where we are headed. But you heard me allude to the next step that we will be working on is moving from that current 9-page template that you have to the narrative form, specifically that 3-page narrative form. We wanted to open it up for discussion here if everyone can utilize the chat box feature, because the first hurdle is really thinking of how am I going to approach this document where I have these brief sentence descriptions or paragraphs, in some case, responses to the questions. How am I going to move from converting that template into some sort of written narrative form? There's no right or wrong answer. This starts getting into aspects of a writing process, and everybody approaches writing differently. So what would be helpful is if you all can reflect on this question and have each individual type in their chat box what you believe would be your first step, so that we can kind of draw on those different ideas to see what's going to make the most sense for each of us in our writing process. So I'll pause now for you to respond in the chat box. Thank you to those who have responded so far. I'm going to pause a little longer because I see that there's multiple people responding at once, which is great. Great. So we're seeing two dominant responses or starting points. First, there are some of you who are saying that your first point would be looking over the template and identifying what the most critical information is to include. And I noticed that Kathy suggests that while doing that, you might be considering the audience of what would someone outside of this work need to understand about our story. Others are suggesting that their first step would be to put the information into the separate document where it's in paragraph form, and then perhaps begin to narrow it down from there. What are the different benefits to these two approaches? So, Kathy, do you mind unmuting yourself and kind of speaking to that first idea of looking through your template to begin with and determining what idea would be, or what ideas would be most important? Can you unmute and just tell us a little bit more about what you were thinking there?
Sure. I just think it's good to look over because there was such a wealth of questions asked and information, and perhaps in short form. So to get the threads that are common, that are leading to those 4 questions that we're being asked to answer. So summarizing and thinking about the audience helps while writing.
So you would do that for each section or component of the CCAT? Because I heard you refer to 4 questions, so just want to make sure I'm clear.
Yeah, I just was thinking of what was narrowed down to the 3 pages and the 1.5. Mm-hmm. So I would look at the, what's being asked of me and pull together all the larger pieces into a summary. But you could summarize all the sections before and then pull it together, weave it together.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, helpful to have kind of a word count, because then you know how detailed to get and what your space considerations are.
Yeah. Kathy, I'm glad that you mentioned the issue with word count. When we're doing the narrative form, there's the page limit, and we'll look at some of the specifications in just a moment of how that can be formatted in the narrative. But when we convert it, so initially what you're given is kind of the page limit, because we know some sections, depending on your own context, you might go into more or less detail on. So you have your overall page limit of what you can go to. When we convert it into that final poster, for formatting purposes, there's really just so many, each box is a certain length and we can only fit so many words. At that point, you do get a word count that you'll need to fit it in. But that's the reason why for the first step of it with the narrative, we just give the page limit to kind of allow you to emphasize and expand in the areas that you feel are needed. But ultimately, you're given a word count when you get to that final step. And I see that Nicole has added a suggestion, in that her suggestion is to have someone completely unfamiliar with the project review the information. Do they feel informed? Is the information understood? Did it convey what you hoped they learned? Thank you for that point, Nicole. We always encourage, once we have written words on paper, 2 things: both reading it out loud to yourself to see, because sometimes just hearing it out loud is extremely useful. And absolutely, if you have others who can review it, sometimes that points out gaps that we weren't aware of because we're so embedded in the context and the work that we are doing. I'm curious, Kim, I saw you were one of the individuals who said that you would put it into the written format as a starting point. Will you unmute yourself if you feel comfortable and speak a little bit more to how you would approach that first step of just going into the written format?
Yeah, I was just honestly piggybacking on what, I forget here in the chat box who had mentioned it. It's just putting all the information into paragraphs versus just having it bullet pointed with, questions and then answers to the questions. I think someone else had mentioned that as well. I think it was Laura. That's basically what I meant, the same thing, taking all the information, reading through it, and then pulling out and putting it all into paragraphs under the specific sections that you're, producing.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Kim. I think having it in that paragraph form, then you can oftentimes see the length as well, and you might decide from there to start, narrowing it down. So there's no right or wrong way to approach it. It really is what makes sense for you and the partners that you're working on we're working with when you're responding and developing this. Our goal is to support you through this process in the ways in which you need to be supported or want to be supported. You'll see on the screen that there are several times for drop-in calls, and these are short 30-minute calls that are optional, but we're encouraged to participate in at your convenience, so that you can kind of discuss anything that you may be questioning or struggling with, or if you have a great tip, then you've done something that worked really well with your writing process that you want to share with others. We have 4 dates throughout the month of May where you can participate in these 30-minute conversations for idea sharing to make sure that you're supported as you're moving from this template into this 3-page narrative form. I also wanted to call attention because there are some greater details provided on the agenda that was sent out for today so that you can see just what the format should look like when you're working on your narrative. So at the bottom of the agenda on page 2, you'll see there's a key upcoming deadlines and resources. In that second bullet, it highlights that your first draft, that 3-page draft for the CCAT, is due by May 31st, and the format is specified there as well. So again, you'll be doing the 3 pages, doing the standard margins, 12 times Roman font. And what we're referring to when we say utilize the 14 major headings from the CCAT guiding questions, those are kind of those 14 sections. So you should have those headings within your description underneath, kind of in paragraph form. So you're speaking to each heading, aside from the synergy one, which is still okay to skip for now when converting this. And then, of course, on there is also the reminder, which you have displayed on your screen right now, of when the drop-in calls will be occurring so that you can receive the support that you desire when working through this process.